Welcome to Chapter 5, the Respiratory System, where I will be leading you guys once again through anatomy and physiology for the pre-hospital care provider, once again, but by me and done by Jones and Bartlett Learning. We've got some learning objectives, as always. Discuss the relevance of understanding the function and structure of the respiratory system to conditions commonly found in the field. State the primary functions of the respiratory system. Identify the organs of the respiratory system and describe their functions. Describe the structure and function of the larynx and the speaking mechanism. State the roles of visceral and parietal pleura in respiration. State the changes in air pressure within thoracic cavity during respiration. Describe the factors that influence the respiration rate. Identify respiratory areas of the brain that control inspiration as well as exhalation. Explain the diffusion of gases in external and internal respiration. Explain how respiration affects the pH of certain body fluids. And describe how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood. So in the respiratory system, we've got the organs and structures associated with breathing, gas exchange, and the entrance of air into the body. These structures are divided into two groups, which are the upper and lower airways. In the upper airways, we have the nasopharynx, the nasal air passage, pharynx, oropharynx, the mouth, and the epiglottis. The epiglottis, by the way, is the flap that controls the intake of either air or liquids or solids going into either your respiratory system or your digestive system. Your larynx, the apex of the lung, carina, base of the lung, the diaphragm, the trachea, alveoli, bronchioles, the main bronchi, are all the lower airway. In the upper airway, we will be dissecting each and every part and then describing how they function. The upper airway inspires air. Inspired air flows into the body through either the nose or the mouth. We've got the nose, the mouth, the tongue, and the jaw, oral cavity, larynx, and the pharynx. The nasopharynx is the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, and nasal passages, including the turbinates, warm, filter, and humidify the air. The nasal mucosa, olfactory receptors, extends from the internal nares to the uvula. External nares or nostrils, the external openings of the nasopharynx. Internal nares are the posterior opening from the nasopharynx to the pharynx. The nasal septum separates the nasopharynx into two parts. And there's also the hard palate. Conchae are the three bony ridges contained within the lateral walls of the nasopharynx. Turbinates are bony convolutions formed by the conchae that help maintain laminar flow. The meatus is a passageway below each turbinate. Moving on to the oropharynx, the oral cavity, it allows air to enter more rapidly and directly. Air is less moist, and it extends from the uvula to the epiglottis. The pharynx is the throat, and it is a point where the nasopharynx and the oropharynx connect posteriorly to form a common cavity, composed of the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. This leads to separate openings of the respiratory system and the digestive system. The lower airway are structures listed here: the larynx, trachea, mainstem bronchi, secondary bronchi, bronchioles, alveolar duct, alveoli, and the lungs. The larynx is the voice box. It's a rigid hollow structure made of cartilage. Thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple, the vestibular folds, which are superior portion of the vocal cords or false vocal cords. Here's a diagram of the larynx. both the anterior and the sagittal view. It shows the epiglottis at the top, which is once again that flap, the hyoid bone, which is your not your chin. That's the mandible. The hyoid bone is what separates your skull from your spine. Your thyroid cartilage, your cryoid cartilage, your tracheal cartilages. You've got your cuneiform cartilage, which is on the side. Ventricular fold, which is the false vocal cord. And once again, all the other different cartilage shown in that sagittal view. True vocal cords are inferior portion of the vocal cords. The glottis is the true vocal cords plus the opening between them. This is the view of the larynx, and is actually what we look for when we insert a, I don't remember what the procedure is called, but it is a plastic tube with an inflated or an inflatable segment on the two inflatable segments in them, and we look for that when we need to open up or get an airway secured when we have an unconscious patient or someone that is struggling to breathe. So you can see here we have the vocal cord, the vestibular fold, and everything's there, and you can see it. This is actually what it looks like. The trachea is the windpipe. This extends downward anterior to the esophagus. This branches into right and left mainstream bronchi at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra. And the carina is a projection of the lowest portion of the tracheal cartilage. The mainstem bronchi, beyond the carina, air enters the lungs through the mainstem bronchi. The hilum is the point of entry for the bronchi, vessels, and nerves into each lung. Mainstem bronchi divide into secondary bronchi, which lead to separate lobes of the lung. Secondary bronchi branch into tertiary bronchi, and this continue to branch eventually into becoming bronchioles. Mainstem bronchi, here we have a diagram of how this sort of breaks down. You may have to take a screenshot and zoom in a bit later. For the bronchioles, these are very small subdivisions of the bronchi. Respiratory bronchioles they develop from final branching of the bronchiole, and each respiratory bronchiole divides from alveolar ducts. So the alveolar ducts are ducts formed from division of the respiratory bronchioles in the lower airway. This ends in clusters known as alveoli. The alveoli are tiny sacs of the lung tissue which gas exchange takes place. Lung contains approximately 300 million alveoli. An alveocapillary membrane lies between the alveolus and the capillary. These are very thin, consisting of one-cell layers. The lungs are the primary organs of breathing. The right lung has 3 lobes, the upper, middle, and lower lobe. The left lung has 2 lobes. The lingula, which is the portion of the left lung that forms the equivalent of the middle lobe in the right lung, and the pleura, which are membranes of connective tissue that envelop the lungs and line the pleural cavity. The pleural cavity is the inner borders of the rib cage, the visceral pleural, and the parietal pleura. Here we can see the pleural space on the outside. This is what allows the lungs to expand and contract freely. Pleural space doesn't really have anything in it. Sometimes there's a visceral fluid or a viscous fluid. Upper lobe, you can see there the middle and the lower. We've got the upper and the lower, and the diaphragm would rest just underneath those lungs. The pleural space is the potential space that exists between the visceral and the parietal pleura. Normally, 2 membranes are close together and a space does not exist. A hemothorax is a collection of blood in the pleural space. A hemopneumothorax is a collection of blood and air in the pleural space, which is why it's usually a viscous fluid that's there, which acts as a lubricant. This is there in most people. When you get a collection of air and blood or just blood, it becomes a problem. Blood flow in the lung, there are two ways. We've got the deoxygenated, and that deoxygenated blood flows in the heart from the right ventricle to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. And this blood supply for the lung tissue, for the bronchial arteries and the veins. Respiration is ventilation, which is the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. Inspiration is inhalation. Expiration is exhalation. Atmospheric pressure is the force that moves air into the lungs, and normal air pressure is 760 milligrams Hg. Pressure on the inside of the lungs and alveoli is almost equal to the outside pressure. When the inside pressure decreases, atmospheric pressure pushes the outside air into the airways. Phrenic nerve impulses stimulate the diaphragm to contract, and thoracic cavity enlarges. Internal pressure falls, and atmospheric pressure forces air into the airways. This is what respiration is. It's a very complicated way by saying. Exhalation, you've got the diaphragm pushing up basically against the bottom of the lungs. The lungs contract, and once those lungs contract, it allows the gases to seep into the alveoli. And once those gases can then get into the alveoli, we now have oxygenated blood, which can then flow back to the heart. And then the whole cycle can repeat with the inhalation process. As the diaphragm contracts, external intercostal muscles contract. Ribs raise and the sternum elevates. The lungs expand in response. There is an opposing effect in the alveoli. Surface tension is created by the attraction of water molecules. Surfactant is a mixture of lipids and proteins. When deeper breath is required, muscles contract more forcefully. And I kind of joke around and say alveoli kind of look like sponges, which they do. And they soak up the gases. Expiration occurs because of the elastic recoil of the tissues as well as surface tension. Diaphragm lowers, compressing the abdomen. Lungs, thoracic cage, and abdominal organs return to their normal shape. Exhalation. Here we have everything sort of pushes up into the diaphragm. And when you inhale, it all sort of tenses up. So that exhalation is when everything just relaxes. Expiration is the diaphragm pushing upward. Surface tension decreases the diameters of the alveoli, increasing the alveolar pressure. Air inside the lungs is forced out. Normal resting exhalation is a passive process. And here we have it again. Respiratory volumes and capacities. Total volume of the lungs can be divided into volumes and capacities. This is useful for diagnosing problems with ventilation. A spirometer is a device used to measure air volumes during breathing. In respiratory volumes, we've got tidal volume, the volume of air inspired during a single respiratory cycle. Inspiratory reserve volume, which is additional air that enters the lung during a forced inspiration. Expiratory volume, which is additional air that is expelled upon forceful expiration. Residual volume, which is a volume of air remaining in the respiratory passages and lungs after any level of expiration. Respiratory capacity, which is the combination of two or more respiratory volumes. Vital capacity, the combination of the inspiratory reserve volume and the expiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory capacity, tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. We have the functional residual capacity, expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. And then we have the total lung capacity, which is the vital capacity plus the residual volume. In the control of breathing, respiratory control has both involuntary and voluntary components. Involuntary centers of the brain regulate respiratory muscles. The respiratory minute volume is adjusted in response to sensory information from the lungs, respiratory tract, and a variety of other sites. There are respiratory areas of the brain, located in the medulla oblongata. Voluntary control of the respiration reflects activity in the cerebral cortex. Affects output of the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata or pons of the motor neurons in the spinal cord. Medullary respiration center consists of the dorsal and ventral respiratory groups and the respiratory group of the pons. Dorsal respiratory group is important in stimulating the muscles of inspiration. Ventral respiratory group controls other respiratory muscles, and pontine respiratory group, or pons, which we've been saying a lot, may also control the basic rhythm of breathing. Factors that affect breathing rate and depth are certain chemicals, emotional states, lung stretch capacity, and levels of physical activity. Central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata sense carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion changes in the central cerebral cerebral spinal fluid. Peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies sense changes in the blood oxygen levels and increased breathing rate. Here we have neurons in and near the respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata and the carotid bodies as well as the aortic bodies. Inflation reflex occurs when stretched lung tissue stimulates stretch receptors in the visceral pleura, bronchioles, and alveoli. During inspiratory movements is shortened. Emotional upset usually increases breathing rate, and if breathing stops, blood levels of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions rise and oxygen levels fall. Hyperventilation is deep, rapid breathing that lowers blood carbon dioxide level. This is prolonged breath holding that causes abnormally low blood oxygen levels. Hyperventilation also happens when somebody has a psychologic trauma or is revisiting some sort of general trauma. The gas exchange, alveoli carry on exchange of gases between air and blood. Alveoli, which are microscopic air sacs clustered around the distal ends of the alveolar ducts, and each alveolus consists of a tiny space inside a thin wall. The gas exchange is the inner lining of the alveolus made of a simple squamous epithelium, and this is a dense networks of capillaries that are found near each alveolus. The respiratory membrane is at least two thicknesses of epithelial cells and a fused basement membrane layer separating the air and the alveolus from the blood and the capillary, where blood and the alveolar air exchange gases. Diffusion is the process which a gas dissolves in a liquid. This occurs when regions of highest pressure towards regions of lower pressure. The pressure of a gas determines how it diffuses from one region to another. Gases diffuse between areas of higher pressure and lower pressure until two areas are equal. Carbon dioxide diffuses from blood to alveolar air. Oxygen diffuses from alveolar air into blood. As long as breathing continues, alveolar partial oxygen pressure stays relatively constant at 104 millimeters Hg. PaO2 is partial pressure of oxygen. PaCO2 is partial pressure of carbon dioxide. In gas transport, about 98% of oxygen transported by blood binds the iron-containing protein hemoglobin in red blood cells. The remainder dissolves in plasma, and in the lungs, oxygen that dissolves in blood combines rapidly with the iron atoms of hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. As PaO2 decreases, oxyhemoglobin molecules release oxygen, diffusing into nearby cells that have depleted their oxygen supplies in cellular respiration. Here we have a diagram showing how this process works. From the alveoli of the lung, to the capillary, to the typical oxygen consumption in a systematic tissue, to the hemoglobin and the Hypotic tissue, which is the exercising muscle, receiving that oxygen. In gas transport, carbon dioxide levels increase in blood as blood becomes more acidic or blood temperature rises. This causes more release of oxygen, and more oxygen is released into skeletal muscles during physical exercise. This increases carbon dioxide concentration, decreases pH, and raises body temperature. Hypoxia is a deficiency of oxygen reaching the tissues. This may be caused by hypoxemia, anemic hypoxia, inadequate blood flow, or cellular defects. Blood transport carbon dioxide to the lungs either as carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma, part of a compound formed by bonding to hemoglobin, a bicarbonate ion. The amount of dissolved carbon dioxide in the plasma is determined by its partial pressure. The higher the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissues, the more of it will go into solution. Only about 7% of carbon dioxide transported by the blood is in this form. Carbon dioxide differs from oxygen that it would bond with the amino groups of the globin or protein portion of these molecules. Hemoglobin can transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide at the same time. Carbaminohemoglobin is formed when carbon dioxide loosely bonds with hemoglobin. This decomposes readily in regions of low carbon dioxide partial pressures. Bicarbonate ions formed by the most important carbon dioxide transport mechanism. Carbon dioxide reacts with the water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme in red blood cells that speeds the reaction of carbon dioxide and water. Results in carbonic acid that releases hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported by the blood in this form. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveolar response and to relatively low partial pressure of carbon dioxide in alveolar air. Hydrogen and bicarbonate ions in red blood cells simultaneously recombine to form carbonic acid. This quickly yields carbon dioxide and water. So that was basically the end of Chapter 5, the respiratory system in anatomy and physiology for the pre-hospital provider. Thank you once again for listening to this readout of the slides, and I will see you again next time.